America in the 1920s was a laissez-faire utopia. It was a country in which you could do whatever you wanted, buy whatever you wanted, all with a dollar backed by gold so it never lost value. By 1929, these reckless policies led to an economy of so much speculation and bad debt that it collapsed under its own weight. If not for the government's swift and decisive action after this collapse, we may have never recovered. Every single word I just said should be familiar to you. It's the story we were all told about the Great Depression, and every word of it is a lie. This fake story is not the result of mistakes made by well-meaning but incompetent historians and economists, but a deliberate narrative designed by the crash's perpetrators to not only shed responsibility for the harm they caused, but to put the blame squarely on its victims which they created. The story they tell begins shortly before the crash, so it never answers the real questions. Anyone can tell you that an economy built on bad debt and speculation is doomed to fail. The real questions are, why was there so much bad debt? Why were so many people speculating? Austrian economics can give us the answers. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is the Austrian School of Economics and the Great Depression. Let's jump in! The story of the Great Depression really begins in the aftermath of World War I. All of the great powers of Europe financially ruined themselves to fight that war. Even the winners were facing down the possibility of total financial collapse. One of the measures every European state took was to move their currency off of the gold standard. This would allow them to print unlimited amounts of new currency with which to finance the war effort. But they totally pinky promised that they'd get back on the gold standard when the war ended. And you can always trust the government. But the economic devastation of the war made it difficult for the European nations to actually realize that promise. So until they fixed their economies and got back on the gold standard, they were going to suffer some serious problems. The biggest one being that Europe's remaining gold would flow into America. America's rightful reward for maintaining its gold standard should have been the wealth of the world. But instead, it got the Great Depression. Why? Well, let's take a look at what America was up to during this time. America after World War I was nothing like the laissez-faire Wild West people make it out to be. Alcohol, one of the most traded commodity types on Earth, was totally banned. Tariffs were high. And, as would turn out to be the primary cause of the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve maintained an intentional policy of inflation. The way the government saw it, they were practicing a Keynesian policy where they'd slowly inject newly printed currency into the economy to stimulate it. But the government didn't just print these dollars and drop them out of an airplane. They weren't stupid. They were going to buy stuff with it. Usually they'd issue loans. This increase in the supply of loans lowered the interest rates on the entire loan market. The interventionists viewed this as another good. Easy money means more investment and more economic growth, right? Well, in reality, it just causes recessions. You see, the Keynesians aren't exactly wrong that their policies stimulate economic growth. The problem is that the growth they're creating is in the form of malinvestment. Money isn't just another commodity or good on the market, it's fundamentally unique from all others, because at its heart, money is communication. Money is speech. The price of products, services, and debt tells you something. The most talkative form of money is interest rates. When you're taking out a loan to grow your business, the interest rate on that loan is telling you something very important. If the interest rate is 10%, it's telling you that unless your idea is good enough to profit by at least 10%, then the idea is not worth investing in. That someone else has an idea that is worth 10%, and so is more worthy of the money. In a free market, this is the mechanism by which malinvestment is prevented. But in an environment of governmentally lowered interest rates, the money lies to you. Let's say that the free market interest rate should be 10%, but the government artificially lowers it to 5%. In this situation, when taking out a loan to finance a project that would only give 7% returns, the free market would have informed you that this is a bad idea. But with the interest manipulated down to 5%, taking out the loan will seem like a great idea. This all sounds good in theory, but what does it mean in practice? Well, in the case of businesses, it means producing goods for which there's not enough demand. In the lead up to the 1929 crash, farmers were taking out cheap loans to expand their farms and create food no one actually wanted. Part of the Great Depression was a crisis of low food prices, brought on by farmers overproducing goods, all financed by low-interest loans. They would have known not to do this if the interest rates were higher like they should have been. And remember, instead of funding the creation of food no one wanted, those loans could have gone to finance projects that there was actually demand for. The problem is even worse when it comes to investors. The interventionists love to point out how there were a lot of people margin buying the market before the crash, and this reckless speculation was a major cause of the crash. Even the Hoover administration, in an effort to support their interventionist policies, blamed margin-buying speculators for the crash. But in the eyes of the Austrian school, this is a particularly vile lie on the part of the interventionists. The interventionists never actually investigate why these people thought it was a good idea to buy on margin in the first place. The reason for that lack of interest is simple. Even a cursory investigation into the matter would show that it was really the interventionists' fault. You see, buying on margin is when you take out a loan with which to purchase equities, which is a fancy word for stocks. When the equities go up enough, you sell them, use the profits to pay off the interest, and pocket the difference. So with a free market interest rate of 10%, the money is telling the investor that he needs to be confident that his investment will make at least a 10% profit in time to pay off the loan. This ensures that only investors confident in their skills will buy on margin. But in an environment of governmentally lowered interest rates to, say, 3%, even a stupid investor will feel like they can beat that. So why not buy on margin? It would actually be stupid not to. And remember, the loan going to that naive investor isn't going to someone who could make better use of it. When interventionists blame margin buyers for the crash, they're gaslighting and scapegoating away their own primary involvement in the crisis, and shifting blame onto its victims. Now, Keynesian economics isn't so wild that it advocates for unlimited government stimulation of the markets. Keynesians have ideas as to what the limits of intervention are. But America's policy in the 1920s was not actually Keynesian. It was even more radical, and that's thanks to one man. Meet Benjamin Strong, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and one of the greatest thieves in human history. The victim of his crime was the entire population of the United States. American isolationism during the 1920s is considerably exaggerated, because, especially in financial matters, America dominated the world stage. Like the other nations of Europe, the United Kingdom was losing its gold reserves to the United States. The UK's economy was reeling due to both domestic and international problems, and its leadership was utterly incapable of handling the situation they led their own country into. But Benjamin Strong came to their rescue. Primarily on behalf of the United Kingdom, but also France and Germany, Benjamin Strong used his position in the United States central banking system to advocate for intensified inflation. This inflation would be used both to weaken the dollar, preventing precious metals from leaving fiat Europe and entering gold standard America, and to lend out that printed money in the form of low-interest loans to the Europeans. All of this was kept totally secret, away from the eyes of the American people. With such major decisions being kept out of the public eye, it's almost like America wasn't actually a democracy. So did the United Kingdom and other European states at least use this treasonous aid to get back up on their feet and return to the gold standard? Ha! Of course not! Instead, they used the sudden influx of cheap money to grow their economies and dominate nations less capable of taking advantage of Europhilic American central bankers. Between its already inflationist policies and Benjamin Strong's lobbying on behalf of foreign powers, the American money supply went up. By a lot. Between July of 1921 and July of 1929, the American money supply went up 61.8%, an average annual increase of 7.7%. That's a lot of money suddenly entering the economy. And much of it didn't even enter the American economy, but the economies of foreign powers. No matter how much help America gave its former allies and enemies, it was never enough. Europe became addicted to cheap credit, so much so that even Benjamin Strong started refusing their demands for more inflation. These catastrophic policies couldn't last forever. In September of 1929, suddenly realizing that much of the supposed economic growth was actually malinvestment, the stock market, itself artificially pumped by those very same low-interest loans, crashed, wiping out many investors, particularly amateurs who only started buying on margin because of how low the interest rates were. The US food market was crushed by a massive overproduction of foodstuffs, paid for by cheap loans. The European economies were hit even harder, as American investors, who were only there because of Benjamin Strong, had to pull out, forcing the credit-addicted nations of Europe off the sauce cold turkey. Naturally, the interventionists responded by printing more money, trying to force the interest rates back down, and beginning public works projects. This was largely led by the Hoover administration. who, contrary to the popular narrative, was not just willing to intervene in the economy, but was actually the most interventionist administration in American history up to that point. In 1932, he even signed off on one of the largest peacetime tax increases in American history, which ironically saw the federal government's revenues go down. It's almost like the economy was suffering from the very pressures he was putting it under. But in spite of their clear failures, Hoover was proud of his policies, bragging about them in many of his speeches. The following Roosevelt administration would intensify Hoover's interventionism, which failed so badly that there was another recession in 1937. Bear in mind, this was still during the Great Depression. A recession during a depression is a truly impressive level of incompetence. Finally, if you take nothing else away from this video, consider this. In every economic crisis before the Great Depression, the US government refused to intervene. Instead of becoming depressed, the markets always sorted themselves out in at most a couple of years. The 1929 crash and following depression was the first economic crisis that America didn't rapidly recover from, and it was also the first economic crisis which was met with large-scale government intervention. And that's Austrian economics and the Great Depression. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And if you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, becoming a channel member, and PayPal, links to all of which can be found below. Up next, we're going to talk about democracy. More specifically, we're going to talk about its detractors. I'll see you then.